Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now I grew up in South Africa, a place that's beautiful, complex, and still figuring itself out. And a big part of that figuring it out process involves looking back at the stories we were told, the histories we were taught. Because history isn't just a collection of facts, it's a narrative. And, for a long time, the narrative about South Africa was written by people who weren't exactly aiming for unbiased accuracy. They were writing a story to justify their own actions, a story that made them the heroes. So today, we're not just looking at history, we're performing an exorcism. Today, we're uncovering the top 10 colonial lies that still impact South Africa. These aren't just old tales from dusty books, they are ghosts that haunt our present, shaping everything from our economy to our conversations. These myths were powerful tools. They were designed to make the unjust seem just, the illogical seem logical, and the theft seem like a gift. And the craziest part? Many of these ideas are still floating around, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, influencing policy and public opinion. They are the invisible architecture of inequality, the foundational cracks that still threaten the building we're all trying to live in together. Understanding these lies is the first step to dismantling them, to seeing the world in South Africa for what it truly is, not what someone wanted it to be for their own benefit. So, grab a seat, maybe some rooibos tea, because we're about to go on a journey. We're going to peel back the layers of propaganda and misinformation. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame for the past, it's about understanding the present. It's about giving ourselves the power that comes with knowing the full story, the real story. Because only when we see the lies clearly can we start to build a future based on truth. Let's get into it. Alright, let's kick things off with the big one, the foundational lie upon which almost everything else was built. The idea that when the Dutch first arrived at the Cape in 1652, the land was basically empty, Terra Nullius. It's a Latin term that sounds very official, very legal, which was exactly the point. It makes dispossession sound like a bureaucratic procedure instead of, just taking stuff. The story goes that Europeans stumbled upon a vast, unpopulated paradise, just waiting for some industrious folks to come and build farms and cities. It's a beautiful romantic image. It's also complete and utter nonsense. This narrative conveniently erases the existence of the Khoi, the San, and various Bantu-speaking peoples who had been living, farming, trading, and building societies across southern Africa for centuries, even millennia. These weren't just a few scattered nomads wandering aimlessly. These were complex societies with their own political structures, trade routes, and deep cultural and spiritual connections to the land. The idea of an empty land was a deliberate marketing campaign. It was the for sale sign the colonizers put up on a house that was already occupied. By claiming the land was empty, they sidestepped the morally awkward question of, hey, whose land is this anyway? The lie of Terra Nullius wasn't just a historical inaccuracy. It was a legal and philosophical weapon. It was the justification for the mass seizure of land. If the land belongs to no one, then it's up for grabs, right? It's finders keepers. This principle allowed colonial powers to claim ownership without treaty or purchase. It transformed indigenous people from inhabitants and custodians into trespassers on their own ancestral homes. It was the ultimate gaslighting campaign on a continental scale, telling millions of people that they didn't really exist in a way that mattered to the newcomers. Think about the psychological impact of this. You're told your history doesn't count, your presence is irrelevant, and your claim to the ground beneath your feet is invalid. This wasn't just about property, it was about erasing identity. The landscape itself was rich with history, with names, stories, and sacred sites. But the Colonial project sought to wipe that map clean and draw a new one, a map where their story was the only one that began at the beginning. The empty land myth was the first and most crucial brushstroke in painting a picture of Africa that served the colonial agenda. And this lie has a long afterlife. It's the ghost that haunts every single debate about land reform in South Africa today. The argument you still hear, sometimes subtly, is that the land was undeveloped or unused before Europeans arrived, implying that black South Africans have a weaker claim to it. It sets up a false dichotomy between productive colonial land use and primitive indigenous existence. But the land was never empty. It was full of people, full of culture, and full of history. Acknowledging that simple truth is the first step in untangling the mess that followed. Now for the sequel to the empty land myth. the follow-up album that really took the colonial project mainstream, the idea that colonialism was a benevolent, charitable mission to bring civilization and progress to the so-called Dark Continent. This is the lie that paints the colonizer as a teacher, a missionary, a hero lifting the poor, ignorant natives out of their supposed misery. It's the idea that before the ships arrived from Europe, Africa was a place of chaos, superstition, and barbarism, just waiting for the gift of European culture, religion, and technology. It's a narrative that positions colonialism not as an invasion but as an intervention. This lie is incredibly seductive because it frames a violent, extractive process as a noble cause. It's the, "we're doing this for your own good" argument. But what did this civilizing mission actually entail? It meant the systematic dismantling and demonization of everything that was already there. Indigenous knowledge systems, which included sophisticated agricultural techniques, astronomy, medicine, and metallurgy, were dismissed as primitive witchcraft. Complex social and political structures like the kingdoms of Mapungubwe or Great Zimbabwe, whose ruins stand as a testament to their advancement, were ignored or attributed to foreign influence because the colonial mindset couldn't accept that Africans were capable of such feats. Art, music, and spiritual beliefs that had sustained communities for generations were branded as pagan and backward. Missionaries arrived, and while some may have had good intentions, their mission was fundamentally one of replacement. They taught that to be civilized was to be European. You had to dress like them, speak their language, worship their God, and most importantly, adopt their economic and social values. This wasn't an exchange of cultures, it was a hostile takeover. The goal wasn't to add to what was there, but to erase it and start again from a European-approved year zero. The lie of the civilizing mission also provided the perfect cover for economic exploitation. While they were supposedly civilizing the locals, colonial powers were also conveniently civilizing Africa's diamonds, gold, rubber, and other resources right onto ships bound for Europe. The infrastructure they built, the railways and ports, wasn't a gift to the African people. It was designed with one primary purpose: to get resources from the interior of the continent to the coast, so they could be shipped back to enrich the metropole. It was a one-way street paved with good intentions and raw materials. Ultimately, this myth is about power. By defining civilization as exclusively European, it automatically places African people and their entire way of life on a lower rung of the human ladder. It creates a permanent hierarchy where the colonizer is always the teacher, and the colonized is always the student, forever in need of guidance and control. This thinking didn't just justify colonialism in the 19th century, it laid the groundwork for apartheid in the 20th and continues to fuel racist stereotypes and attitudes in the 21st. It's the lie that whispers, "they should be grateful for what we gave them," without ever acknowledging what was stolen. Okay, this next one is a particularly insidious piece of historical revisionism. It's the idea that apartheid, the brutal system of institutionalized racial segregation that began officially in 1948, was some kind of unique, separate invention of the Afrikaner National Party. The narrative suggests that it was a sudden break from the past, a strange and terrible aberration that had little to do with the century of British colonial rule that preceded it. This lie is useful because it allows colonialism, particularly British colonialism, to wash its hands of the whole messy business of apartheid. It's like, whoa, that was awful, but don't look at us. That was those other guys. But let's be clear, apartheid was not a new invention. It was the logical, brutal culmination of colonial policies that had been in place for generations. It was colonialism on steroids. The National Party didn't invent racial segregation, they just perfected it. They took the existing, often informal systems of segregation, dispossession, and labor control that were the bedrock of British colonial rule and codified them into a rigid, inescapable legal framework. They gave it a name, a bureaucracy, and an ideology, but the foundations were already there, laid brick by the previous administration. Think about the core elements of apartheid: the pass laws which controlled the movement of black people. They existed long before 1948. Land dispossession, culminating in the Natives Land Act of 1913, which restricted black land ownership to a tiny fraction of the country. That was a cornerstone of British colonial policy, designed to force black people off their land and into the colonial economy as cheap labor. The creation of native reserves, which later became the Bantustans. That was the colonial blueprint for separating populations and creating pools of manageable labor. Apartheid simply took these existing practices and made them more efficient, more systematic, and more ideologically driven. The British approach was often a bit more, well, British. It was a nod and a wink, a gentleman's agreement that everyone knew their place. The National Party just wrote it all down in triplicate, stamped it, and hired a guy with a sjambok to enforce it. The motivation was the same, to ensure a permanent supply of cheap black labor for the mines and farms, and to maintain white political and economic supremacy. It was the same song, just with a much louder, more aggressive Afrikaans accent. So why is it so important to connect these dots? Because separating apartheid from colonialism allows us to misunderstand both. It makes apartheid seem like a uniquely South African madness, rather than the product of a global colonial system, and it lets the broader legacy of colonialism off the hook, presenting it as a more benign, gentlemanly form of domination. But the truth is, you can't have one without the other. The seeds of the Bantustans of Soweto of Sharpeville were all planted in the soil of colonial conquest. Apartheid was the bitter fruit that grew from that poisoned tree. Have you ever looked at a map of Africa? Really looked at it? You see all those straight lines? It looks like someone took a ruler and just drew borders across the landscape, cutting through mountains, rivers, and deserts. Well, that's because that's pretty much exactly what happened. And the lie we were told was that these borders were natural, logical, and created for the sake of stability and good governance. It's the idea that the modern map of South Africa, and actually all of Africa, is a rational arrangement of territory. But the reality is far more chaotic and honestly, cynical. These borders were not drawn in Africa. They were drawn in Europe. Most famously at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where European powers gathered around a map like it was a game of Risk, carving up the continent among themselves without a single African representative in the room. Their primary concerns were not ethnic cohesion, historical territories, or linguistic groups. Their concerns were resources. You can have this river, if I can have that patch of land with the diamonds. I'll trade you this potential port for that stretch of fertile ground. It was a geopolitical feeding frenzy. The result in South Africa, as elsewhere, was the creation of artificial states. Communities that had coexisted and traded for centuries were suddenly split in two by an arbitrary line on a map. The Sotho people, for example, found themselves divided between South Africa and the new nation of Lesotho. The Swana people were split between South Africa and Botswana. These borders were invisible walls driven through the heart of nations, severing kinship ties and disrupting long-standing economic and social networks. It was a recipe for instability, not order. At the same time, groups that were historically rivals or had little in common were suddenly lumped together within the same colonial territory. They were forced to compete for resources and influence within a new, unfamiliar political structure imposed by a foreign power. This divide-and-rule strategy was a classic colonial tactic. By forcing different ethnic groups into a single administrative unit, and then often favoring one group over another, colonial authorities could create internal tensions that kept the local population preoccupied with each other rather than with their common oppressor. This legacy of arbitrary borders is something South Africa and the entire continent are still grappling with today. It fuels ethnic tensions, creates disputes over resources, and complicates regional politics. The lie that these borders are natural is a way of hiding their violent and self-serving origins. They are not ancient, and they are definitely not logical. They are the scars of a European land grab, drawn in ink and enforced with gunpowder, and they continue to shape the political landscape in profound and often painful ways. So you arrive in South Africa, and you quickly notice that most official business, media, and education happens in English or Afrikaans. For decades, this was the undisputed reality, and the underlying message, the lie, was that these were the languages of power, of intellect, of modernity. The other languages, the 9 other official languages we have today, like isiZulu, isiXhosa, and Sesotho, were treated as secondary. They were vernacular, tribal tongues, fine for the home or the village, but not for the serious business of running a country or getting a good job. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate policy of linguistic imperialism. Language is more than just words. It's a carrier of culture, history, and identity. By elevating English and Afrikaans, the colonial and apartheid states weren't just choosing a practical medium of communication. They were asserting the dominance of the cultures those languages represented. English was the language of the British Empire, of global commerce and administration. Afrikaans, a language born in Africa but championed by the architects of apartheid, became the language of nationalist power and oppression. For Black South Africans, this created a huge barrier. To succeed in the system, you had to master the language of your oppressor. Your own mother tongue, the language of your ancestors, your stories, and your proverbs was devalued. In schools, children were often punished for speaking their own language. The infamous 1976 Soweto uprising was sparked directly by the government's decision to enforce Afrikaans as the medium of instruction in black schools. It was the ultimate insult. Not only will we oppress you, but we will force you to learn about your oppression in our language. The consequences of this linguistic hierarchy are still felt today. English remains the de facto language of power, business, and higher education, creating a disadvantage for millions whose first language is something else. It perpetuates the colonial idea that European ways of thinking, expressed through European languages, are superior. When you marginalize a language, you marginalize the people who speak it. You tell them their worldview, their literature, their way of expressing complex ideas is less valid. It's a subtle but powerful tool of control. While South Africa now officially recognizes 11 languages in its constitution, a huge and important step, the struggle for true linguistic equality is far from over. Decades of suppression mean that indigenous languages often lack the resources and formal vocabulary for things like science and technology. Not because they are inherently incapable, but because they were never given the chance to develop in those spheres. The lie that only English and Afrikaans matter was a way of silencing the majority, and giving them their voice back means actively promoting and developing all of our nation's languages. This one often comes wrapped in a package of misplaced nostalgia. It's the lie that colonial education, for all its faults, was superior. You'll hear people say, at least the mission schools provided a proper education, or that the standards were higher back then. The implication is that the education provided to Black South Africans by colonial and apartheid systems was a gift, an act of charity that, while limited, was better than what they would have had otherwise. This narrative paints the colonizer once again as the benevolent teacher. But we have to ask, what was the purpose of this education? It certainly wasn't to create a generation of black leaders, thinkers, and innovators who could challenge the colonial system. On the contrary, the architect of apartheid education, Hendrik Verwoerd, was chillingly honest about its goal. He famously said, "There is no place for the Bantu in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. What is the use of teaching the Bantu child mathematics when it cannot use it in practice?" The goal was to train, not to educate. It was to create a compliant, semi-skilled workforce that knew its place. This Bantu education system was designed to teach Black South Africans just enough to be useful to the white economy, to be clerks, laborers, and domestic workers, but not enough to be a threat. It emphasized obedience and rote learning over critical thinking. History was taught from a purely European perspective, geography focused on the colonizer's world, and science was limited. Most damningly, it was designed to instill a sense of inferiority, to teach black children from a young age that their culture was primitive and their destiny was to serve. Beyond the curriculum itself, the system was criminally underfunded. Black schools had vastly larger class sizes, fewer resources, and less qualified teachers compared to white schools. Pictures from the era tell the story. Dilapidated buildings, children without desks or books, a system starved of resources by design. This wasn't a superior education, it was a deliberately stunted and crippled form of instruction, engineered to reproduce inequality generation after generation. It was a tool for social control, masquerading as enlightenment. So when we hear the myth of a superior colonial education, we have to challenge it. It ignores the rich traditions of African knowledge systems that were completely erased from the classroom. Knowledge about ecology, community governance, and oral history. It glosses over the explicit, racist intent behind the system. And it sets up a false comparison because we can never know what educational systems indigenous societies might have developed on their own had they not been violently interrupted. The education that was given was not a gift, it was another chain designed to bind the mind as surely as physical chains bound the body. This is a big one, a lie you can literally see and touch. The roads, the railways, the ports, the grand government buildings. The argument goes that colonialism, for all its problems, left behind a legacy of valuable infrastructure that benefited everyone. "Look at what we built," is the cry. It suggests that the colonizers were nation builders, investing in the development of the country for the good of all its inhabitants. It's a tempting argument because the evidence is right there, made of steel and concrete, but it's a deeply deceptive picture. We need to ask a simple question. Who was this infrastructure built for, and what was it built to do? Let's take the railways. If you look at a map of the old railway lines in South Africa, they don't connect population centers in a way that would serve the general public. Instead, they form a very specific pattern. They run from the interior, where the mines and farms were, directly to the coastal ports. Their primary function wasn't to help a Zulu farmer get his produce to a market in a different region. It was to get gold from Johannesburg and diamonds from Kimberley onto a ship to London as efficiently as possible. The same is true for the roads and ports. They were arteries of an extractive economy, designed to pump the wealth out of Africa and into Europe. The cities that were built, like Johannesburg, were designed around the needs of the white settler community and the industries they controlled. Black people were allowed into these spaces only as laborers. They lived in townships on the periphery, often with poor sanitation, unpaved roads, and inadequate services. The infrastructure was not for them, it was for servicing them as a labor force. Think about the power grid, the water systems, the hospitals. For decades, these services were disproportionately and often exclusively routed to white neighborhoods. A sprawling suburb would have electricity, running water, and pristine parks, while a township a few kilometers away would have none of it. This wasn't an oversight, it was policy. The infrastructure was a physical manifestation of the racial hierarchy. It was built to serve the comfort and profit of the colonizer, and the benefit to the colonized was incidental at best, and often non-existent. So yes, the infrastructure exists. But to claim it was built for everyone is a profound lie. It was built to facilitate exploitation and entrench segregation. The post-apartheid government inherited a country where the very layout of its cities and transport networks was a map of inequality. The challenge since 1994 has been to try and repurpose, extend, and reimagine this infrastructure to serve all South Africans, not just a privileged few. It's like trying to turn a funnel into a fountain, a massive, difficult, and expensive task that continues to this day. Okay, let's talk about a lie that is very much alive and kicking in the present day. It's the argument you hear in response to calls for land reform. It goes something like this. Apartheid is over. Everyone has equal opportunity now. The past is the past. We can't just take land from people who bought it legally. Land reform is unnecessary, and it's just a way to punish white farmers. This narrative attempts to slam the door on one of the most painful and unresolved legacies of colonialism and apartheid land dispossession. This argument is built on a foundation of willful amnesia. It conveniently forgets that for centuries, black South Africans were legally barred from owning the vast majority of their own country's land. The 1913 Natives Land Act was the climax of this process, officially allocating about 87% of the land to the white minority. This wasn't a fair real estate market, it was state-sponsored theft on a grand scale. To then turn around in the post-apartheid era and say, okay, the game is fair now, everyone start from where you are, is fundamentally dishonest. It's like a thief telling his victim, I'll stop stealing from you, but I'm keeping everything I already took. The idea of equal opportunity is a fantasy when the starting blocks are this staggered. Generations of wealth, security, and agricultural knowledge were built on that stolen land by the white minority. At the same time, generations of black South Africans were crowded into impoverished reserves, forced into migrant labor, and denied the ability to build wealth through property ownership. This has created a structural inequality that a few decades of democracy cannot simply erase. The economic power that comes with land ownership is still overwhelmingly concentrated in the hands of the white minority. Furthermore, the argument often frames land reform as an attack on current farmers, ignoring the historical injustice that gave them that land in the first place. It also ignores what land means. It's not just an economic asset. For many indigenous communities, land is identity, it's ancestral heritage, it's a spiritual connection. The loss of land was the loss of a way of life. The debate isn't just about economics, it's about justice, dignity, and restoring a stolen birthright. So to claim that land reform is unnecessary is to deny the very basis of South Africa's inequality. It's to pretend that the single most significant act of colonial theft has no lasting consequences. Without addressing the land question in a meaningful and just way, the promise of a truly equal and reconciled South Africa will always remain hollow. It's not about punishment, it's about repair. It's about acknowledging that you cannot build a stable house on a foundation of stolen ground. This is perhaps the most pervasive and comforting lie of all, for those who benefit from the status quo. It's the simple, dismissive idea that colonialism is in the past. It's something for the history books. It happened a long time ago. We've moved on. Why keep bringing it up? This argument treats history like a light switch that was simply flipped off in 1994, with the first democratic election. It suggests that the effects of centuries of systematic oppression can be wiped away by a single political event. But colonialism is not an event, it's a structure. It's a system that fundamentally rewired the economy, society, and even the psychology of a place. And those wires don't just disappear. Think about the economy. The colonial model was designed to extract raw materials from South Africa and create dependency on manufactured goods from Europe. This structure, in many ways, persists. The South African economy is still heavily reliant on exporting minerals and agricultural products, while struggling to build the diversified industrial base that creates widespread wealth. The economic patterns established under colonialism have proven incredibly durable. Then there are the social impacts. The racial hierarchies created by colonialism didn't just vanish, they linger in our cities' segregated layouts, in the vast wealth gap that still largely runs along racial lines, and in the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices that people still carry. The trauma of colonialism, the violence, the dispossession, the humiliation, is not something a nation just gets over. It's passed down through generations, affecting everything from mental health to community cohesion. It's the ghost in the room, the unspoken weight that shapes so many of our interactions. The educational and knowledge systems are another example. We're still grappling with curricula that privilege European history and thought. We're still fighting to validate and integrate African knowledge systems into our universities and schools. The idea that one way of knowing is superior to another is a deeply ingrained colonial concept that takes decades of conscious effort to unlearn. It's in the languages we prioritize, the experts we listen to, and the stories we tell about ourselves. So, to say colonialism is in the past is to fundamentally misunderstand how history works. The past is never truly past. It's the soil in which the present grows. The inequalities and challenges South Africa faces today are not new problems, they are the direct logical outcomes of its colonial history. Ignoring that connection is like a doctor trying to treat a patient's symptoms without ever asking about their medical history. You can't solve a problem if you refuse to understand its origin. Colonialism isn't a closed chapter, it's the book we're all still living in. And finally, we arrive at the most audacious lie of them all. It's the pinnacle of colonial arrogance. It's the claim that South Africa's wealth, its mines, its farms, its status as the most industrialized nation in Africa, is a direct result of colonial development. The argument is that without the ingenuity, investment, and administration of the colonizers, the country's vast mineral resources would have just stayed in the ground, and South Africa would be a poor, undeveloped backwater. In short, it's the lie that says, you should be thanking us for making you rich. This narrative is a masterpiece of twisted logic. It's like a burglar breaking into your house, stealing your television, and then demanding you thank him for discovering you had a television in the first place. South Africa was not poor before colonialism. It was rich in resources. The gold, the diamonds, the platinum, the fertile land, they were already here. Colonialism didn't create this wealth. It organized a system for extracting it as efficiently as possible for the benefit of the colonizers and the imperial powers back in Europe. The development that did occur was completely skewed. The vast profits from the mines didn't build schools and hospitals in the townships. They built fortunes in London and Amsterdam. They funded the lavish lifestyles of a small white elite in South Africa. The black laborers who dug the wealth out of the ground, often in horrific and dangerous conditions for poverty wages, saw almost none of it. Their labor was the engine of this development, but they were treated as disposable parts, not as beneficiaries. To call this a gift is a cruel joke. It was a smash-and-grab operation on a national scale. The colonial system was not designed to develop South Africa for South Africans. It was designed to underdevelop it, to create a permanent state of dependency where the country's resources flowed out and its people were kept in a state of subjugation. The wealth was not a product of colonial benevolence, but a product of African land and African labor, seized and exploited through colonial violence. This lie is crucial to dismantle because it attempts to reframe exploitation as generosity. It asks the victims of theft to be grateful to the thieves. The truth is the opposite. South Africa's wealth is its own. The challenge today is to reclaim that wealth and ensure it finally benefits all the people of the country, not just a select few or foreign interests. The country's potential was not unlocked by colonialism, it was shackled by it. And we are still working to break those chains and build a system where the nation's incredible riches can create a better life for everyone. So there you have it. 10 myths, 10 powerful stories that were crafted to justify the unjustifiable. From the lie of an empty land to the fiction of benevolent development, these narratives did more than just distort history. They actively shaped our present. They built the invisible walls of our society, the psychological barriers and the structural inequalities that we are still trying to tear down today. Recognizing these lies for what they are is not about dwelling on the past. It's about understanding the blueprint of the house we're living in, so we know which walls are load-bearing and which ones need to be demolished to let the light in. The fight against these colonial narratives is a fight for the soul of the country. It's a fight for a future where a child's opportunities aren't determined by the lingering ghosts of a racist past. This isn't just a South African story either. This pattern of justification, of creating myths to sanitize conquest, is a global one. Challenging these narratives here helps us connect with similar struggles for truth and justice all over the world. It's about reclaiming the right to tell our own story in our own words, from our own perspective. So I encourage you, don't let the conversation end here. Read books by African historians, listen to the stories of elders in your community, question the statues in your city squares, ask yourself who benefits from the stories we are told. Because by challenging these old colonial lies, we do more than just correct the historical record. We empower ourselves to imagine and build a more just and equitable world. We take the pen back and begin to write our own future. Thanks for watching.